In this interview, I'll be talking with Stephen Thomas, the Clean Energy Manager with the David Suzuki Foundation, about a letter urging Prime Minister Mark Carney to get on with the business of building a national power grid. The letter is signed by more than 100 community, Indigenous, and climate groups. So, welcome to the interview, Stephen.
Thanks, Mark. I'm great to be here.
Here at Energy Media, we are big fans of if not a national grid, at least two or three regional grids, bigger regional grids.
Sure.
Because there's some technical issues apparently about building transmission towers through the Canadian Shield, that sort of thing. But the point here that we make is that basically electricity is the foundation of a 21st century economy. And if the power grid is your table stakes in this game, and if you don't have a low cost, reliable, clean grid, then you're starting way back in the pack. And I assume that is approach is undergirds this letter.
Absolutely. And this is what we're trying to show with this broad support for building out an east-west electricity grid in Canada, particularly one that's based on renewables and upholds the rights of workers and the rights of Indigenous nations, Indigenous rights holders. It's because this is where we have to start in the energy transition. There is a lot of uncertainty right now. That's a big part of the impetus of this letter, is demonstrating that clear support. But even with that uncertainty, no matter what crystal ball you're looking in, Canada is going to need a lot more electricity in the decades to come. That's because of electrification, as you've already mentioned, things like moving away from gasoline and diesel in our cars to electric vehicles, electric public transport, and the same thing in our homes. Moving away from burning gas or oil in our homes to things like high efficiency heat pumps to keep ourselves warm in the winter and cool in the summer. We're talking about doubling or even tripling the amount of electricity in the next couple of decades. And we can't do that without upgrading our electricity grid. The good news is that this comes with huge benefits. I'd love to talk about all of the reasons why we think this is a good idea, but the three big ones here are that it makes energy bills more affordable for Canadians, it increases the reliability of our electricity system, and it kind of rises to this moment when we come to the threats that we're facing from the United States about building infrastructure here in Canada that creates good jobs in place when and where it's needed. So very happy to talk about the letter.
It's really funny. I was interviewing Ed Hurst, who's an energy economist at the University of Houston, and this was in the early days of the Trump furor, and he said, "You Canadians have a great power grid. Why don't you just come down to the United States, lure away all the data centers that we're trying to build, put them up in Canada, and then take the electricity that you were exporting to us and use them for the data centers." And wouldn't that be an interesting wrinkle, for President Trump? And I have to admit that made me laugh. Here was an American advocating a strategy that would effectively, I think, annoy the president. So I got a chuckle out of that. Well, what you've now asked for a number of things in the letter, and one of them is major federal funding for interconnections and between the provinces. And what kind of money are we talking about here?
I mean, first, it's funny that you mentioned that American example because it's the case in Canada that most of the interties that we've built between regions have been between individual provinces and the United States. We are more integrated with the US than we are integrated with each other when it comes to electricity. So that's what we want to try and change here. And this, I'll say too, is an idea whose time has come. It's been 15 years of study after study after study that shows that building these new high voltage electricity links, these lines between provinces in particular, can lower energy bills, make electricity more reliable, and do that work of better integrating low cost wind and solar. But the problem and the point on funding that you're mentioning here is exactly that. The problem has been that when we get around a table and talk about who pays for this, it's been a challenging conversation. So we need federal funding and we need the political will to get this done. That's what's beautiful about this political moment when we're searching for big solutions to the big problems that we're facing. And so that's what we're calling for first and foremost is federal funding to the tune of $20 billion over a 5-year period to get this started. We think it'll actually need more, but that's the kind of commitment, investment that we need to see to have all the parties around the table feel comfortable that this can actually get done and that provinces on both sides of the line, that Indigenous communities on whose territory these projects are being built, and other stakeholders, utilities, et cetera, that they can all see the benefit in this.
There's a very practical reason why this letter is important, and that is that a major barrier to more east-west trade, more interconnections between provinces has historically been political. Provinces with their little feuds, like Alberta and British Columbia, they have one interconnection, and BC is mad because Alberta's throttled it back for whatever reasons. And Saskatchewan is finally talking to Manitoba, and they're making some progress. Quebec doesn't, on and on. And we have this political gridlock that has prevented this kind of national power grid before. And as you mentioned, this is a very unique moment in time where there finally is political will amongst the premiers, with the federal government, and far and away the majority of Canadians. So a letter like this uh, communicates to the Prime Minister, hey, this is still a hot issue. You need to get on with it now.
That's exactly right. We're already seeing that change. There's some great examples recently of an intertie between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. That's before the regulator right now that has good ownership stakes from Indigenous communities, Mi'kmaq communities in both Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Examples of projects being talked about between Manitoba and Nunavut, and other examples too. But I think that's also the beautiful thing about this is it's not one project. Sometimes you hear things like energy corridor, and I don't think that's practical or like a real idea here when it comes to the electricity system. It's not one line that goes across Canada. It's multiple strategic interties when and where they're needed. And if you have a couple provincial premiers that can't agree, that really is too bad. But that doesn't stop the other premiers from doing the good work of building lines between their provinces. So it's piecemeal. If we can get started on the kind of low-hanging fruit very quickly and build toward bigger interties, more interties with provinces that may take longer to come around the table.
Yeah, Canada already has 77% of its power is clean and firm, by which I mean 60% hydro and 17% nuclear. And then the rest is there's another 7 or 8% of renewables. But clearly, if you look at the situation in the United States, in Europe, China, uh, all of the power generation that's coming on is wind and solar, and then there's good reasons for that. You can't get a gas turbine, a combined cycle gas turbine. You're years in the queue before you can even get one because there's so much demand. Whereas renewables, it's a year or two, boom, you've got that on into your system. But there's another point here and this is because we do a lot of work in Alberta, and I have these conversations with former grid managers and so on, and they're stuck on this idea that a renewables dominated grid is an inherently unstable grid. And I've had interviews with so many experts outside of Canada who say the grid you build for where it has a high percentage of renewables has to be different than the grid you had when it was hydro and nuclear and gas and coal. They're two different styles of grid. And I think that's a very important message that has to be sent to Prime. The guy's an economist. I'm sure he knows this, but it's not well known, I think, in the public discourse.
I think you're right. And I think that's why the name of the game here is collaboration. It's a different way to manage our energy and specifically our electricity infrastructure. One province isn't selling it to the other in a one-way street. It's all about sharing electricity between borders when the wind is blowing in one place but not in another, when the sun is shining in one place but not the other, integrating with things like storage and efficiency and certainly hydro. That's what this is all about, is collaboration between geographies, between provinces. But you mentioned another point that I think is really important here too. Like this is happening in a political moment in Canada where we're looking to build big things quickly. We're looking to address these crises we're talking about with affordability, with the climate crisis, and with the threats from the states. Not 10 years from now, not 15 years from now, when if we're lucky, we might see something like a pipeline or a carbon capture project. But we're looking for this right now. We're looking for kind of shovels in the ground and projects that we can get to work building and start creating the hundreds of thousands of jobs that are possible in this clean electricity system. So with wind and solar, it's 2, maybe 4 years between, proposing a good project and getting it built. These are things that we can start significant construction on very soon, and that's the name of the game here. Transmission, admittedly, takes longer, and that's the whole point of this letter and the whole point of this kind of political moment, trying to land it on transmission links, is that we need to really commit to this different kind of electricity system that you're talking about here too, to make sure that we can better integrate the lowest form of electricity possible, which is wind and solar.
One condition or a request in the letter that I really caught my eye is attaching labor conditions to funding. And apprentice training would be a big part of this. And I think I agree with that 100% because this is a moment in time when we're undertaking a nation building project. We have youth who are having trouble finding good paying jobs. We don't have enough trades. This is an opportunity to focus and get young people into the labor market, get them in trades, get them in professions like engineering, and where they'll have a job for basically for life. I mean, this is because this is such a big project over so many years that we need the labor, and I think was a very good addition to your letter.
Totally. It's a near-term and long-term thing. We really need to get moving and be in a hurry to address this crisis, but we need to think about what's going to be here 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now. And that's why we want to prioritize renewables over things like fossil fuels, especially fossil fuel export projects. But this can easily be coupled with something like the Youth Climate Corps, with union-led training programs, because as you're saying, this is for the long game. So we can plan not only jobs but careers with this sort of thing. But in the near term, we're excited too because this is like when we talk about what materials you need to build a transmission link, it's aluminum and steel. And these are two sectors that are really hit right now with the tariffs from the United States. So if we can build these things in Canada, build up that capacity for manufacturing as well, we can solve, a lot of these problems at once.
It's funny. I was listening to an interview. I think it was just after the election, and Prime Minister Carney was talking, and of course, again, Harvard, Oxford-trained economist, and he was talking about. He says, "I'm going to talk a little nerdy now. I'm going to talk about backward linkages and so on." Well, to anybody who's got a little smattering of economics, you go, "Oh, linkages, aha!" Somebody's thinking strategically now, and so given the fact that we have the leadership in place to create and manage a national strategy like this. We might not have had that in the past, but we have it now. Doing things like, having labor conditions. But another one that is in the letter that I really, really liked was boost support for efficiency, demand side management, storage, those kinds of things. And this is something that Canadians probably don't understand because we've had a stable grid for 125 years. We've got one of the most stable, clean grids on the planet. But elsewhere, there is basically a technological revolution going on in the industry. And grids are changing. They're being modernized. They're becoming more like platforms for trading services and trading electricity. And it's a very dynamic time within the industry. And we need to bring that mindset to this project. We're not just building out what we already have. It's a fundamental change in the electricity system.
That's right. And we talk about the big flashy infrastructure because that's what this moment is about. When we talk about big transmission links between provinces, very large wind and solar projects that have Indigenous ownership, this sort of thing. But what's exciting about this is that it unlocks so many other good things when it comes to health, when it comes to affordability, when it comes to keeping ourselves comfortable and secure in the face of climate disasters. It's things like demand side management, energy efficiency, making us more comfortable in our homes. These things too benefit from an electricity system that's built out with this in mind. So that's just one of the exciting things about this. The thing that I want to try and work into this conversation too is that this is happening in a political context where it's not coming out of nowhere. We're talking about things like Bill C-5, the Building Canada Act federally, and others provincially that are at risk of making some big mistakes and are at risk of listening to some very bad ideas, both in terms of process and in terms of projects. With projects, we've already touched on it here, but it is such a mistake. It would be such a waste of time and money to invest in things like oil pipelines or fossil fuel export projects like LNG or things like carbon capture on tar sands mining, for instance. These are bets against Canada's future prosperity. It's a bad idea for many reasons. Whether or not certain premiers or even our federal government would like to admit it, the era of fossil fuels is ending. So it's not an environmental stance only to make this shift to renewables. The rest of the world is moving away from oil, gas, and coal, and it's such a mistake if we were to really double down on trying to sell those things to a shrinking pool of buyers internationally. But
If I can jump in here, Stephen, I want to make a point because here at Energy Media, we have a take on this. And the way we frame the conversation is that there are two basic worldviews. That of OPEC, which says that oil and gas is going to expand out to 2050 and then plateau for decades. And then the IEA, which has said in no uncertain terms, the age of oil is dead. We're entering the age of electricity. And if you look at the latest oil 2025 report from the IEA, they've actually moved peak oil demand up from 2030 to 2029. That's how fast things are moving. And so the problem with that is that the narrative in Canada and the support for these projects like pipelines are not driven by math. There's no business case that's been advanced for them. They're being advanced by narrative. And narrative is easy. People just go, oh, okay, that sounds like a good idea. Why don't we do that? And it extends right up to the top, right up to Mark Carney, who should know better, that there has to be a business case for this. And there isn't. And so we need to reframe the conversation around this to make it a much more rigorous process. What are we going to do? What makes sense, knowing where the likely direction of the energy system and the global economy is going? What makes sense? And a letter like this helps to further that necessary conversation.
yeah, the Prime Minister loves hockey analogies, and there's a good one here, which is Wayne Gretzky's quote that we need to look to where the puck is going, not where it is today. And the puck is going toward clean electricity. So I couldn't
Oh, I
agree
have to
more.
jump in. I'm sorry, Stephen. I rarely interrupt a guest, but I have to tell you, it was actually Wayne Gretzky's father, Walter,
I
not
appreciate
Wayne.
that. The other Gretzky, appreciate that.
Yeah.
Very cool. So the other point here, when I was talking about kind of mistakes that can be made in this moment where we're in a big hurry, is one on projects, which I think we talked about, but the other is process. So with Bill C-5, the Building Canada Act, it's again about to make some big mistakes, I think, where it's giving the federal government's giving itself power to skirt things like environmental impact assessments, step over inherent and treaty rights of Indigenous rights holders, and avoid or otherwise miss big opportunities when it comes to workers' rights and what we can do with jobs here in Canada. And the good news, too, about the clean electricity system, upgrading our grid, renewables, is that we don't need to do any of that to make these projects happen. We're already talking about the faster timeline that wind and solar and storage can be built. But we shouldn't compromise on kind of what makes Canada such a, what makes the structure around energy so strong with environmental assessments and making sure that we respect the free, prior, and informed consent of every Indigenous nation on whose land these projects are being built. There's a lot of confusion, it seems, about free, prior, and informed consent, about whether or not it's a veto or this sort of thing. It's not that complicated to me. Consent means consent, and if there's no consent from the nation on whose land this project is being built, there should be no project. So that's what's exciting for us too about some of the signatories and so many Indigenous nations in Canada who are already leaders when it comes to clean electricity. They're good examples of Indigenous-owned transmission lines, Indigenous-owned wind and solar projects, and Indigenous communities are now the second biggest asset holder of renewable projects in Canada. So it's about continuing that and supporting that too.
Yeah, I wanted to bring that up because BC Hydro has been a leader in this. The last earlier this year, BC Hydro brought out an integrated resource plan and a 10-year capital plan, and they're looking ahead to about 2% a year load growth, which is at 15 or 20 years of flat, there's nothing, and all of a sudden, boom! Now we're electrifying. We need more electricity. So what they said is, we're not going to build another dam after Site C. What we're going to do is contract through power purchase agreements with independent power producers, and First Nations will be at the front of the line. And so First Nations have been doing this and either have expertise or they're partnering up with private sector companies to bring forward very credible projects. And so, what a great economic development opportunity for that nation in its community, and you basically move forward with new generation, and it doesn't cost the government. It's not the hydro that's paying for the capital cost. It's not the government that's paying the capital cost. It's essentially the private sector is paying the capital cost. And there was a study done out of Alberta by the system operator that getting to a net zero electric system in Alberta, 90%, 90% of the capital costs would be borne by the private sector. They're going to build the generating station. They'll build some of the transmission lines. And so there is a way to do this with Indigenous groups, with community groups, that we're actually kind of leading the pack on.
Yeah, and that's why this like keystone of support from the federal government on this transmission piece can unlock all of those other investments that you just mentioned. I think the BC Hydro example is a great one for that procurement because I think every project except for one had more than 50% Indigenous ownership, and the one that didn't had 49%. It's not, we're not talking about small numbers anymore. It's a good example that I think provinces across Canada should take when we're talking about procuring electricity in a way that allows Indigenous nations to own and operate these projects and benefit from them over time. So that's what we're excited about supporting in this letter, and that's what we're excited about with the breadth of support for this letter too. I've been doing this work for a while. When we talk about things like high voltage transmission lines between provinces, it's typically something that only energy nerds are paying attention to. But this is really a moment where people see the benefit see the public good from all of the knock-on effects of something like this in Canada. So that's why we're excited to support it today.
Yeah, I would say that's absolutely the case. I mean, energy media has a pretty large viewership these days, and we run into a lot of our viewers and readers on social media. And I would say that overwhelmingly they are in favor of building out the national power grid and electrification. I mean, they see that that's the way the world is going. They know that to be economically competitive, Canada has to follow suit. Preferably lead, but at the very least, we have to do it too. And letters like this, support like this, that's contained in this letter to the Prime Minister, I think is an important part of the process. So, Stephen, thank you very much for coming and talking to us today.
Absolutely. I hope the next time we chat, it's about some specific examples of projects that are getting support, Indigenous owned renewables in Canada. I think there's a path here that we can have some really good stories to tell over the next couple of years. So thanks for this.